Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating, honestly pretty highly charged debate that blew up from a viral video. The whole thing kicked off when a high school teacher had a very public, very emotional breakdown online because his students literally could not read. But instead of offering sympathy, the commentators in the source material we're looking at today used this moment to launch a massive, multi-layered critique of everything from modern education and society right down to parenting. Now, my goal today is absolutely not to take sides. We're just going to objectively break down their arguments so we can truly understand the anatomy of this wild debate.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the roadmap for today. We're hitting 5 key areas: the senior reading crisis, failing systems, the crisis of parenting, societal fallout, and finally, educational solutions. All right, section 1, the senior reading crisis, and that teacher's viral breakdown. So to understand where these hosts are coming from, we've got to look at the video they're reacting to. It features a high school teacher who is clearly distraught. He's literally crying on camera. He explains he's teaching high school seniors. We're talking 17 and 18-year-old kids who are hypothetically just months away from college or the workforce, right? And he gave them a super simple reading assignment, just 2 paragraphs to read and 1 single sentence to complete. The stakes here are just shocking, because he points out that he provided sentence stems, effectively modeling the exact answer, and even gave them the answers before the problem started. But despite all that, they couldn't fill in 4 simple words. Now, you'd probably expect an outpouring of sympathy for this poor guy, right? Well, the hosts of A Righteous Perspective offered absolutely none. 0. Instead of comforting him, they went right on the offensive. They basically asked, how on earth is an educator inside the system just now realizing this? They point out there is a huge paper trail of data from middle school testing all the way to freshman placement that tracks exactly where a student's reading level is. So to these commentators, the teacher's tears didn't really look like compassion. To them, it looked way more like the guilty realization that he was actively participating in a totally broken system. And that brings us directly to their first massive target, Section 2, Failing Systems, and their intense critique of public education. These hosts definitely don't pull their punches when it comes to public schooling. Actually, they redefine it entirely. They argue that modern public schools are basically just a jobs program for teachers and a babysitting service for parents. In their view, the system is no longer set up to produce productive, literate members of society. Not at all. They claim the real goal is just keeping teachers employed, collecting those union dues, making sure kids are physically present, and just keeping complaints to an absolute minimum. To back this up, they point to a system that relentlessly pushes failing students forward. Just keeping the assembly line moving no matter what. They argue there's this weird obsession with standardized testing, combined with what they call indoctrination, basically focusing heavily on social issues rather than teaching kids how to actually read. Throw in the elimination of standard letter grades, just to spare students' feelings, and, well, they argue you've got a perfect recipe for systemic failure. And this brilliantly illustrates their point. The hosts bring up this crazy story about a high school in Baltimore. So a mother realized her son, a high school senior, mind you, could not even read or write his own name. High-profile attorney Ben Crump actually stepped in initially to sue the school system over it. But as the hosts tell it, Crump quickly dropped the case once he hit a brick wall. The harsh legal truth? You can't really sue a public school system for failing to teach a child to read. So what was the school's only solution? Moving an 18-year-old senior all the way back to freshman year to start completely over. Just wild. But public schools are only half the equation for these guys. Section 3, the crisis of parenting and blaming the home environment. So the hosts heavily push back on that popular modern idea, the whole it takes a village to raise a child thing, where teachers are seen as the primary molders of youth. They completely reject that. Instead, they double down on strict family responsibility. Their stance is that education does not start at the schoolhouse doors. It starts and ultimately ends right at home with the parents, the aunts, the uncles, and the whole extended family. They argue that modern parenting has severely lost its way. One of the hosts drops this really striking quote: "We have parents today that want to stunt for the gram, they want to stunt for TikTok." And the point they're making here is that a huge chunk of parents today are putting social media clout, superficial appearances, and chasing online trends way above the intellectual development of their own kids. And they paint a pretty vivid picture of what this looks like in practice. They talk about parents who teach their first graders to flip off cameras for attitude instead of getting them ready for academics. They cite educators who say they're making hundreds of unanswered phone calls about failing kids. Yet, ironically, those exact same unresponsive parents are the very first ones to show up on graduation day, ready to literally fight the administration when their functionally illiterate child doesn't get a diploma.
To the hosts, this is absolute proof that parents are just treating schools like free hands-off babysitting. All right, let's see how this all connects. Section 4, societal fallout and the danger of disorganized thinking. We've talked about the schools and the parents. Now let's look at the macro level. So the crucial point is this foundational philosophy one of the hosts introduces. They say reading is organized thinking. And think about that. It's not just about sounding out words on a page, right? They argue that learning to read at an early age is literally the primary way human beings learn to structure their thoughts. If you can't read, you can't organize your thinking. And if your thinking is disorganized, well, you definitely can't write, because writing is just organized communication. And they claim this creates a really devastating chain reaction. It starts with illiteracy, which immediately leads to that disorganized thinking. Because these kids can't communicate effectively or, reason properly in a professional setting, the hosts argue this is going to create a massive, permanent underclass. This group, they say, will inevitably see much higher rates of crime, and ultimately they're going to require total, lifelong reliance on government safety nets just to get by. Which brings us to a countdown that the commentators find truly terrifying. 1. Just 1. That is the exact number of years until these functionally illiterate 17-year-old seniors turn 18. Think about it. In exactly 1 year, they are going to have the exact same voting power as you do. The hosts warn that this dynamic creates a huge surge in what they call confident ignorance. They even go so far as to argue that certain politicians actually want a poorly educated voter base purely because they're so much easier to manipulate. The claim here is that a dumbed-down society will just roll over and accept restricted, highly regulated lifestyles. They specifically point to concepts like 15-minute cities, arguing that people will happily trade away their independence in exchange for convenience and government handouts. Now, I know this paints a pretty bleak picture, but they don't just sit there complaining. They actually offer some really aggressive solutions. Let's move to Section 5, Educational Solutions and Taking Back Control. What's really interesting about this comparison is how they frame the problem globally. They look at the current cultural priorities in the United States, which, again, they sum up as stunting for the gram, and contrast that with the developing world. They point out that countries like Nigeria are aggressively pushing early learning in things like AI and coding, while places like China and India are just laser-focused on rigorous foundational academics. Basically, they're saying that while America is busy playing around on social media, the rest of the world is actively preparing to dominate the future. So what's their big, ultimate takeaway? Basically, it's a call to entirely abandon reliance on government-run education. The commentators firmly believe that putting your child in a public school right now is basically playing roulette with their future. They are straight up demanding that families step in, take immediate personal action, and reclaim the responsibility of educating their own kids. And the steps they suggest? Totally uncompromising. They strongly advocate for homeschooling, even arguing that giving up luxury items like downsizing your house or selling that Mercedes is completely worth it if it means your child learns to read. If you have to use private schools, they insist on heavy vetting, and they specifically praise accredited Christian schools. But they don't just put it on the parents. They're calling on aunts, uncles, everyone to step in as tutors if they see a relative slipping. In today's information age, they argue ignorance is a choice. Parents can, and absolutely should, be using free online tools to teach their kids the basics right from their own living room. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. If, as the hosts argue, reading is organized thinking, who is ultimately responsible for organizing the future? Is it the systemic framework of our public schools, or does the buck stop entirely at the front door of the family home? It's a heavy debate for sure, but an absolutely crucial one to understand. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.